Okay, I'm going to move us on now to our second keynote speaker, Lachlan Monsbourgh from Rabo Bank. Lachlan is currently Head of Sustainable Business Development at Rabo Bank Australia and was recently involved in global cocoa sustainability as Research and Development Manager with Barry Callebaut. As the head of Barry's global cocoa sustainability R&D, Lachlan leads a global team in the development of farming and environmental systems of our cocoa supply chain. He has spent his career developing commercialisation. Gosh, it's gone very busy. It's like the M25 around here suddenly. Lachlan spent his career developing and commercialising agriculture systems with various crops across Asia, Latin America and the Pacific. One of his current works is to research into profitable cocoa farm models that can be serviced by long-term finance in West Africa. Lachlan grew up on a farm in Australia and obtained his Bachelor of Business degree in Agriculture Commerce from the University of Sydney. I'll hand over to Lachlan. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I don't think I'm going to be able to give the sort of presentation you just saw from Anika. It is banking, it is fairly cerebral, so please don't fall asleep. In the program it said something like I was going to talk about green bonds and a few things like that. What I'm going to do is step it back one level and talk actually about essentially how banks are now challenged to build a non-financial picture of their clients and what that means for agriculture, okay? And then we can talk about some of the sexy products that are down the way, all right? So just a bit of background on myself. As Nikki said, I come from Victoria originally. I spent about 16 years overseas, with most of that in New Guinea. So I worked for 8 years in New Guinea, mainly on plantations and running a cocoa trading business, so exporting cocoa out of New Guinea. So worked probably most of my adult life with fairly remote Indigenous communities on the mainland and in the island of New Guinea. I was one of the first companies to go into Bougainville after the Civil War. And set up business there, which was an interesting experience. But it just showed, I think, the importance of agriculture to communities in the worst case, and how unifying it can be. And with some of what Anika spoke about this morning, generally agriculture brings people together. And without, how can I say this? But without sort of a unifying cause around agriculture, and I think climate change is that, that it can become really fragmented. So the strategy that Anika was talking about is absolutely critical to us as a community to sort of bring us together, because I see probably coming back to Australia after 16 years away, I see a fairly polarised and divided community. This isn't Rabo Bank talking, this is Lachlan Monsbourgh talking, for anybody who's writing this down. But I think that's something that I really see that is a positive out of all this. It actually makes us think about our neighbour, makes us think about what we're doing together. So what I'll talk to you now about is building the financial picture for non-financial picture for financial institutions. I've given you a little bit of an introduction to myself. I'll talk about why financial institutions need to do it, and consumer perceptions around the Ipcc, and that's the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change and their recommendations, and also just what's Rabo Bank doing. I'll spend 2 minutes on that at the end in terms of what we're doing around that. So, straight into it. What is the need for banks to understand the non-financial performance of their clients? I think the biggest need is client intimacy. A lot of the findings around the Royal Commission were about banks giving money with not a real understanding about what that money was being used for. Okay? And I've asked the question there on the screen, is it regulatory, production, climate, geopolitical, market or social? It's all of the above. We need to have an understanding of that. And the most important thing is, how can we talk about it in terms of opportunities? rather than just using it as a big stick to whack people with. We've got large amount of pressure. We're a multinational bank, but we also have a large amount of pressure from all the regulators that regulate the financial industry, whether it's the ECB, the European Central Bank, whether it's APRA, the Australian financial regulator, the central banks. Their requests for information about what we actually bank is growing and growing by the day. Now, we're a cooperative bank ourselves, so we don't have investors per se like the big four in Australia, but there's more and more investor pressure, which Anika referred to in terms of, hang on, if I buy shares in your company, what is the money, where is this money going to? Or if I deposit money into your bank in terms of savings, what are you using that money for to lend on the other side of the coin? Okay, so this is the sort of understanding that we need as banks in this space. So how have we done it previously? I would say pretty poorly, to be honest. I'm new to financial services. I've been in banking for 2 years now. And what I saw on the non-financial side of things is essentially information collected qualitatively, subjectively. It's very difficult to sort from a portfolio perspective. So how can we have groups of clients? And differing levels of quantity and quality. Through talking with colleagues who work in other banks, this is quite normal across banking. Okay? The other thing that's critical in this is that credit at a farm level still absolutely has a human-to-human level of judgment. Okay? This is not just an algorithm that you put in and you either get your loan or you don't, right? It still has quite a degree of trust and a human level. It's not feudal in the sense that in the sense it's the overlord saying to the peasant, hey, yes, you can take that loan on your crop and I'll see you at harvest time. But it stems from, and the level of credit being on a personal like, but it stems from an understanding that agriculture is highly variable and that the human ability to manage that is an important part of the matrix. I've just got a little note there. There's a fantastic book which I read when I sort of joined financial services, which I think everyone can read. It's a bloke by the name of David Graeber, who works out of the London School of Economics. He's written a book called Debt, the Last 5,000 Years. And it's essentially a history of debt, which is just, I found it fascinating because it actually sort of, it outlines how it has become part of our language. So that all contributes to essentially the non-numeric part of our credit submissions, where essentially we write a profile of the farmer. Now, why are banks apprehensive, and I say somewhat apprehensive because we're doing it, of a non-financial discussion? Your relationship as a farmer with a banker is probably around the balance sheet of your business, okay, of your farm accounts, okay? To ask the bank to sort of provide help or guidance outside of the balance sheet is probably new territory, right? The other thing that's critical is that bankers are used to generally being quite agnostic. And it can be dangerous also to take highly moral positions. And the question I ask to everyone, at what degrees of exposure do you start and stop with clients? We're all, let's say, exposed through our consumption, or our farming decisions to some things which have big question marks over them at the moment in the global landscape. The use of glyphosate, Okay, just because Brazil bans glyphosate, do we all now don't bank farmers, right? So there's all these sort of questions where I guess as soon as we step away from the non-financial side of things, we're quite scared of. The other thing that's important to think about is the lack of absolute unilateral, acceptable and agreed metrics in the non-financial sphere. So what am I saying there? With finance, financial ratios are clearly defined and have been clearly defined for hundreds of years. The rate of return, things like that. When we start talking about the metrics around climate change, let's say just for instance carbon dioxide equivalents, there's still scientific debate about whether or not methane should be separated or whether methane should be included, right? So as soon as we enter into the non-financial realm, there's still a lot of things that aren't absolutely accepted. And to that point, often opinions are subjective and there are multiple valid opinions. So we're not saying that something's wrong, but we're saying that how do you decide between multiple valid opinions? The black and white nature of a balance sheet is often much easier to deal with. So there's been a huge step change in the last 9 months in terms of the financial regulators and central banks' oversight of our operation. Now, one, in the domestic context, the Royal Commission's happened. So essentially you've seen the pendulum swing to a far greater degree of compliance. The other thing that I think's made a huge difference to how central banks are viewing the situation is that when our great mates over the other side of the Pacific pulled out of the Paris Accord, I think the central banks and the financial regulators woke up and said, hang on, the political solution has been severely damaged, right? The political solution to climate change has been severely damaged with the US pulling out. With that, we've noticed essentially the level of communications and the level of requests from central banks and regulators around the world outside of the US has increased dramatically. So that 2023 ECB little note on the screen, that means that we have to report, so as a European bank, we have to report the full emissions of every portfolio that we have across the globe to the European Central Bank, right, by 2023. Okay, so you can see the step change that has occurred in just the last 12 months. So that means every dollar that we lend, we have to account for the emissions profile of that. Okay. However, the rate of change is pretty slow. The Kyoto Protocol was actually signed in 1997. And the other thing that's quite probably worrying is that 90% of the predictions that were made by climate scientists to actually sign the Kyoto Protocol have proven absolutely correct. Okay, so essentially the Paris Climate Accord is completely built on known science. All right. Where I'm going to go now is essentially what does it mean for Australian agriculture being a signatory to the Paris Climate Accord? And I'd like to present this chart, which thankfully the Ipcc provided, but it basically summarises their 600-word report that was released, I think in August, on the Ipcc land use report, which essentially gives us guidelines, and this is a publicly available document, it basically gives us guidelines as signatories to the Paris Climate Accord of what we have to do to keep temperature rises under 2 degrees by 2050. So I'll just let you just have a look at that, because I think one of the key things that we're conscious of now in the bank, as a bank, is how do we have these conversations with our clients around essentially these responses, and how are we going to incentivise the findings of this report. Okay, and we'll get into that. But there's, as you can see, it's quite complex, and also in some ways a little bit contradictory in terms of, in the demand management, there's dietary change, which if you get into the detail means less red meat. But then, and I've circled here, it says reduce grassland conversion to cropland in a response option for agriculture. So my question would be to the Ipcc, hang on, what are we going to actually do with that grassland if we can't grow red meat on it, right? If we're not allowed to convert it, okay? So there's extremely complex, I'm not saying that we're for or against either one, but there's some extremely complex things in this document which have large implications for us, with essentially 80% of our farming land being grazing land, but then the recommendation being for a diet away from red meat. So there's some really challenging and difficult conversation points that we all need to have. And on that further, how are consumers reacting to a growing awareness of climate change? I think Anika touched on a couple of points there. One of the things I've found in sort of leading this within the bank, that the perception about agriculture is actually extremely poor from urban consumers. And it's probably one of the things we need to really address first and foremost. And I think the sort of groups that Anika's involved with, and what's happening across the landscape, are just, that engagement piece with urban people is just critical. I run an induction course with the bank, so every 3 months, 4 months, we get 30 or 40 new people come into the bank. We bring them to the head office in Sydney. We sort of tell them, we sort of indoctrinate them into the cult in the bank, and we actually talk about sort of what the culture is in Rabo Bank as a Dutch cooperative bank and all that sort of stuff. But I run a session on essentially sustainability, climate change, and I start the session with asking people how much do they actually know about the breakup of emissions, right, in terms of which different sectors produce it. And my biggest take home from that is how poorly red meat and agriculture is actually perceived by urban consumers. People think it's anywhere from 30 to 80% of total greenhouse gas emissions, which is just a complete untruth. But that is the perception, and that is some of the reality we're dealing with. And that's why I say, how well the consumers and the broader public actually know the numbers and I believe first and foremost, in terms of agriculture, perception is one of the biggest battles we're fighting. And this is represented in MLA data, okay? So this is an annual survey that MLA run. And as you can see, in the last, from essentially 2013 to 2018 in Australia, we've got essentially 250,000 people each year strongly disagreeing that that red meat production in Australia is unsustainable. All right, so it's basically a 1% rise in each year, and we've seen 8% of the population have dropped off that they strongly agree that it's sustainable. Okay. Climate change is about number 3 on the list on why they think it's unsustainable. Mostly it's around animal welfare concerns. But as I think that's now, those figures there are now 16 months old, 17 months old. As we go, let's say, further down the road into 2020 with more climate protests and things like that, I wouldn't be surprised if we see more and more of that perception that red meat, from a climate perspective, is bad, where that perception, just for the record, ruminant agriculture contributes 12% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and also has a whole heap of co-benefits around it being in natural landscapes, and the fact that 33% of the world's terrestrial land is grassland, and we are actually being told we can't convert it. So just in the last little bit of the presentation, Rabo Bank, we're a Dutch cooperative bank. We started in the 1800s as a bank for farmers. We bought the Primary Industries Bank of Australia back in 1994. We changed the branding around to Rabo, I think, in 2001, if I'm correct. And so we've been part of the Australian landscape now for about 25 years. As you can imagine, and especially in sort of a rural conservative base, dealing with these topics is often a sensitive conversation. So what we're doing now is the bank has a global sustainability framework that essentially lays out the framework of how we can bank. Okay, for our top performers, and we're looking at essentially how we can incentivise, and they are green bonds, climate bonds, and things like that. So the market for green bonds, I think it's incredible. It's an incredible story. Has grown from about $0 in when was that? 2013 to now about $250 billion of funding worldwide. Okay, so that's just in the last 6 years. Just for those who don't know, green bonds are essentially the instrument where large-scale funding packages, sort of a minimum ticket price of about $200 million, $300 million, are built about an asset investment or a portfolio investment that allows essentially environmental or climate-related KPIs to be factored into the pricing of the loan. So I think the best example to give is the one on Woolworths that was released a few months ago. Woolworths wanted to essentially replace all their lighting in all their supermarkets to LEDs. That it was costing them $400 million. So they were able to raise a green bond on the market to fund that change, right? And because they could actually quantify the energy reduction in making that investment, it was eligible for that debt was eligible to be a green bond. So the biggest thing we're doing is, I'll just skip over a few because I'm conscious of time. The biggest thing we're doing across Australia and New Zealand is essentially building a quantifiable and objective database of our clients' non-financial performance, okay? Because that will enable us to meet the requirements of the regulator but also have a far greater intimate relationship with our clients. And I think a question that comes up, is this the right industry to be sort of in when we've got this change? And I'll leave you with this graph, which I think is really, really important. And I apologise for the photo of the graph rather than this. I'm not sure how well you can see it, but essentially this is the change in emissions over the last 20 years, right? And agriculture across all sectors is actually leading. All right, I think this is a critical thing. You can see transport, stationary energy, fugitive emissions off the scale, essentially, and continuing to grow. Agriculture, electricity, and waste management are the three things that have actually come down significantly. So when you're talking to your urban friends, colleagues, associates about climate change, this is an extremely important piece of information, and this is referenced from the Australian National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. This isn't made up jargon. This is government statistics. Okay, so that's it from me, Nikki, and thank you very much. Congrats to Jerry and everything for an excellent conference.
Thank you, Lachlan, and for the record, it's Becky. But I'll go by Nikki. That's all right. No. I'll answer to anything. Yeah. I'm going to open up to the floor if there's any questions or comments. Oh, are you serious? He's doing it for fun. He really is doing it for fun, I know. Okay, here we go. We'll start at the back and we'll work our way down.
Thanks for the presentation. The Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists have developed metrics to measure trends in natural capital, the econ. Is Rabo Bank aware of this and or planning to use the econ to measure trends in natural capital?
Sure. We actually see natural capital as just a part of the whole non-financial metrics piece. We've seen the work that our NAB and CSIRO have worked together on. We believe that farming practices is also a critical part of building a without wanting to use jargon, but building a holistic picture of the of our farming enterprises.
Oh, second question. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah.
So if you incorporated the econ into your, I guess, your business planning, you'd be able to, I guess, capture and reward farmers that are doing the right thing, which aren't necessarily, when a farmer destocks, he's looking after his natural capital, and you guys would be able to, I guess, it would add value to, good practice, good land management. So I think it's worth you guys having a look at it.
Yep.
Thank you. Okay. Any questions at the top of the room before I start going down? No? Yep.
Thanks, Becky, and thank you for the presentation. And this is probably just following on really from that question. There are some industry accreditation programs around that also look at the natural landscape and landholders' commitment to things like biodiversity. Is Rabo Bank looking at those accreditation programs and possibly even able to consider looking at involvement in organisations and movements such as the Landcare movement to add to the non-financial portfolio that you're putting together? The picture.
Sure, it's a great question. I think the critical piece we've got to do first, and this might sound like I'm avoiding the question, I'm really not. The critical thing we've got to do first, and we've done it in New Zealand this year, where there's a bit more regulatory pressure, and we'll be rolling out over the next couple of years in Australia, is we've got to allow the account manager, because we are a relationship bank, we've got to allow our account manager to get intimate with with essentially the non-financial space, okay? And so this is a highly manual process where we put out basically a range of questions on natural capital, farming practices, environmental impact, greenhouse gas emissions, etc. And we literally want, one by one, our account managers to have that conversation around those topics with farmers, right? Once we're comfortable with that our account managers are, let's say, up to speed with the conversation, we then want to look at ways to automate and look at portfolios of where there are already certification schemes in place and the different accreditation schemes to, one, help us with the data, because the data management's huge in all of this, and two, also to essentially facilitate the good work that's already been done. Does that answer your question, more or less? So, in other words, yes, we're looking at it. We haven't got there yet because we want to make sure the people who've got the direct relationship with the farmer are across this topic as well. Yep.
Okay, I'm going to come here, because that's only down 2 steps, and then I'm going to go to you.
Okay, thanks for that. So I guess we can make incremental changes to farming systems to adapt, but maybe at some point we might need to make quite transformative or radical changes.
Yeah,
and
sure.
You know, for example, maybe a group of farmers might want to form a co-op and run kangaroos or camels or something.
Yeah.
So how willing might banks be to consider some of those more risky, really radical options?
And I think this is the real difficulty in what we do, because we're extremely conservative in the way we give money, and we have to be, in terms of the last thing we want is a client to go bankrupt, right? And it's basically, we try and make sure, because it's actually way more, it's just as expensive for us for a client to go bankrupt as what it is for the client. And so we want to make absolutely sure that what people are investing in is a sound investment. What we see, and why we have to sort of take a much greater look in terms of the non-financial information that surrounds every business that we bank, is because with climate change, there's a whole new range of risk that we don't have now. I think, to answer your question directly, there's simply, for those sort of the real sort of transformative, almost startup sort of culture, as a conservative rural bank, we're not set up to bank that sort of stuff. I think I can say that from the get-go. But what we do in the space is, I'm not sure if you've seen, we have a program called Food Bites, which basically is a pitch event which we facilitate for startups and things like that. So we actually we recognise it's there, so we try and facilitate a forum, but actually turning that into banking debt products, we find quite difficult. And I just see it as going to be something around demand too. If we see just more and more people saying, well, hang on, my current business model in 10 years with climate predictions just doesn't fundamentally work, then we will have to, all banks will have to come to the market eventually, because we have to allocate capital.
Thank you. Okay, another question here.
Yes, you touched on the grassland versus cropping issue. Is soil carbon the big unknown there, or the big question, and the build up in soil carbon from you can get from grazing?
Yeah, look, I'm not a scientist for a start, so I've got to be a little bit careful. But my understanding it is that if you have a permanent pasture or a native grassland and you turn it into cropland, essentially turn the soil over, it's actually the release of methane from that process that the Ipcc are worried about. And also, the sequestered carbon of a perennial grassland, if you disrupt that might also be a concern of theirs. But I'm sure some very probably scientific brains in this room who'd be much better equipped to answer that question.
Okay, next question.
Thank you. Hi, I'm a chartered accountant, so thank you for the financial part of the seminar. It's been quite good for me.
Yeah.
But I'm also a researcher into the link between non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and glyphosate. So you mentioned on there about glyphosate. Is the banking sector's concern only about the cost of changing to a product that doesn't contain glyphosate, or have you considered the fact of a dead farmer isn't very productive?
I think I can only speak for the bank I work for, and we're extremely concerned about all factors in the whole glyphosate debate around what it means for our portfolios around the world, and also what it means for the users of the product. Now, from what the initial case was in the US, as you're probably way more learned than me, it was somebody who was using glyphosate essentially every day as a ranger, as a park maintenance person. I would what we are of an understanding of that it's at those sort of exposure levels that Hodgkin's lymphoma is where the person is at most risk, but the exposure to farmers from using glyphosate probably 3 or 4 times a year. I'm not sure, but you might be able to tell me. I'm not sure that we've seen cases where somebody suffering from Hodgkin's lymphoma has actually said, okay, those 3 or 4 times has been the reason why I have this condition now. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I've got a few more questions for you, so I'll just
Sure.
keep going.
Thanks, Lachlan. I'm going to make this unashamedly very local.
Yeah.
I'm part of a Limestone Coast red meat cluster, which
Yep.
has representation from across the value chain, and very pleased to say that the regional manager of Rabo Bank sits on that on that cluster.
Yep.
We have a commitment, I guess, to grow the productivity of that whole value chain.
Sure.
And we're about to move into a sort of a bit of strategic planning phase. So given what you've presented here today, what do you think are the top 3 things that cluster can be thinking about over the next couple of years to grow the productivity across that whole value chain?
All right. Are you talking about productivity from just a pure agronomic sense of more beef?
Sorry, I'm talking about return on investment for the businesses along that entire value chain.
Yeah. Okay. Great. I think actually, with the consumer perception around red meat, becoming able to tell a story about the reduction in your emissions is absolutely critical. I think, and this is me, not the bank. I think that actually a lot of grazing systems in Australia have got a wonderful biodiversity story to tell if they get it right, and if they do the sort of thing that Landcare wants and things like that. I think getting that story out there is really important, and I also think that the whole thing around a natural product. I mean, we're seeing quite a lot of noise, if you like, around plant-based alternatives for protein, and actually I look at the sort of the, how can I say it, the 50-year story of margarine and butter, right? If I believe sort of red meat at the moment is going to be on a similar journey, right? Where synthetic proteins, or sorry, plant-based proteins are going to take some market share, but after a fashion, after a generation or something like that, the actual nutrient complexity that is in red meat and also being able to be farmed on a fairly natural system will in the end be not something that's just wiped off the map. So those would be the 3 things. Yep.
Nice work off the top of your head there. Top 3, I like it. Okay, I've got time for 1 or 2 more questions, so I'll come to you.
Lachlan, thank you for your presentation. The data nerd in me really appreciates the numbers and the graphs.
Yeah, so sorry, it's quite a contrast from an experienced presenter like Anika.
No, much appreciated. I'm looking at your title there. It says Head of Sustainable Business Development.
Yeah.
And you said that you were employed 2 years ago, so that says to me that Rabo Bank had made a big shift. So I'm actually interested in the tipping point to have that position, and I gather you're employed to that position. What was the tipping point? When did it happen? And what was behind that?
Yeah, good question. I think Rabobank's always been conscious of this area, being a farmers cooperative from Holland. But I think it's got more to do with actually Rabobank maturing as a multinational rather than any sort of, let's say, macro environment around them. We're essentially the equivalent of a CBA, a NAB, or an ANZ, or a Westpac in Holland, right? And so the world revolves around Holland. I think now the Australian rural portfolio is Rabobank's biggest or second biggest rural portfolio, right, globally. And so it's more of a situation of, hang on, we're now big over in Australia now. It's not just some sort of tin pot exercise, right, relative to what we do in Holland. We better start resourcing these different departments around the business. And so I think it's got more to do with Rabo Bank than anything else. I think the big change now with the regulators wanting to essentially ascertain our impact on climate as a lender, that will change again in terms of now we've got a local reason to essentially build more positions like this within the bank to start to account for it and to have the conversations with our clients around, okay, what does transition look like? What are you doing well at the moment? What needs to happen in the future, etc.
Thank you. Okay, I've got one final question for you before we let you out of the spotlight. Jerry.
Thank you very much, Lachlan. Whilst we as program designers were very nervous about having a banker present, we are truly thankful you have done that. It's been sensational.
Oh, thanks.
The synergy that we thought we could get by having you follow Anika has really done wonders. Thank you.
Pleasure.
We especially thank you for adjusting your schedule to fit in.
No,
really,
it was my fault.
Really appreciate that. Now, my question is, we've heard our other keynote speakers also say, speak boldly, challenge, and all that sort of thing. So how can you encourage us to challenge the bankers?
I think it's a. I'll put it this way: if you're doing your job as a bank, you're probably not more than 10% in front or 10% behind your clients, right? On a whole range of things. So if our clients move the needle and say, we can hear more and more people say, hey, we want to jump on a green bond. We want to be part of the new world of green finance. We want to, how are you going to bank my carbon credits? How are you going to do this? We have to respond. Okay, so my advice to everybody here, and poor old Sarah, who's the account manager in the room at the moment, she'll be going, oh, Lachlan, what are you doing? Is to actually challenge your bank manager. Ask them, hey, do you have these products? Because that will feed back into people like me, and it's just wait, really. It's just the more inquiries we get. Last week in New Zealand, we sat down with basically all the departments of the bank and wrote the carbon credits policy for New Zealand, right? And that is because of a demand from clients who are planting trees and saying we want to offset these and actually we'd like to borrow money to plant the trees, right? And so these being a relationship bank, that's how we get information, that's how we make the decisions, and hopefully in a couple of years we've actually got instead of anecdotes, we've actually got data to fundamentally reassure us that actually this is where our clients are going.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time this morning. It sounds like everybody has been thrilled with your presentation. It's triggered lots of commentary and lots of questions, and I'm sure that will all continue over morning tea. We've just got a little something to say thank you very much to you.
Thanks, Becky.
So, no worries at all. I got my name right. Becky.
I got 50% of it right. Thanks very much.
Manny said created bold and brought it Town High School.
Oh, very lovely. What sort of timber? Oh, lovely.
Red gum timber, in case anyone's wondering.
Yeah.
Okay, we are now going to go to morning tea until 11:15, so we've got a nice